Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really fascinating look at the shifting political landscape in Australia by unpacking the arguments presented in episode 519 of the political commentary show, The Other Side. Now, this source material features host Damien and Senator Malcolm Roberts of the One Nation Party, and it offers a deep dive into a very specific populist, center-right critique of modern Australia. Just to be clear up front, we aren't here to take sides or endorse any of these viewpoints. Rather, we're simply here to map out their core thesis, so you can understand exactly what's driving this particular political narrative.
The source material honestly covers a lot of ground, so to make it super easy to digest, we've broken it down into 6 key pillars: the rise of one nation, socialism versus free markets, medical regulation and speech, unintended consequences of taxation, energy policy and economics, and finally, the uniparty critique. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the rise of one nation, and analyzing these recent polling surges. And this brilliantly illustrates the host's foundational premise. Changing demographics and some pretty severe voter frustration are leading to a massive populist surge. I mean, the polling data really reflects the shift. Newspoll shows One Nation sitting at a stunning 31% of the primary vote, which actually edges out Labour at 30% and absolutely dominates the LNP at 18%. The Roy Morgan poll echoes this exact same trend at 29.5%. The host asserts that these numbers are the direct result of voters feeling completely alienated by the current political establishment. Taking those numbers a step further, the broadcast cites some pre-budget modeling to map out a hypothetical, yet to them, highly plausible scenario for the federal parliament. In this projection, Labour drops to 76 seats, forcing them into a minority government. The Liberal National Coalition gets practically wiped out, reduced down to just 12 seats, while One Nation grabs a massive 53 seats. The source argues that this puts One Nation well within reach of forming a coalition government, which would fundamentally disrupt the traditional two-party system. Moving right along to Section 2, socialism versus free markets. The economic philosophy debate. Now, what's really interesting here is that the host and Senator Roberts argue incredibly forcefully that Australia has transitioned into what they call a socialist nanny state. According to the host, 2.6 million people, that's 17% of the entire Australian workforce, now work for the government. They claim this bureaucracy has bloated to an astonishing $240 billion a year, eating up more than a third of the entire federal budget. They argue this represents a huge fundamental shift away from private enterprise and toward big government reliance. Furthermore, the host brings in some research from the Fraser Institute, indicating that 53% of Australian youth aged 18 to 24 now view socialism positively. For the host and Senator Roberts, this metric is a huge red flag. They argue that this cultural shift toward socialism and the equal distribution of wealth, rather than wealth creation, literally kills aspiration, kills motivation, and ultimately tanks national productivity. To kind of contextualize all of this, the host maps out Australia's productivity on a timeline. They argue that the early center-right, free market reforms of the Hawke and Keating era laid the essential groundwork for peak prosperity under John Howard. However, from 2005 to 2015, they claim Australia entered this lost decade of slowing growth. Fast forward to today, and they point to recent data showing a paltry 0.3% GDP growth and a 0.6% drop in labor productivity. The broadcast's explicit conclusion here is that on a per capita basis, Australia has actually been sitting in an economic recession for years. All right, Section 3, medical regulation and speech, the AHPRA controversy. Pivoting to a deep dive into medical policy, the primary target of their critique is AHPRA, that's the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. The source material comes down really hard on this regulatory body, claiming it is actively silencing medical professionals. Specifically, the broadcast highlights the cases of Dr. Andrew Amos and Dr. Gillian Spencer, arguing these doctors were investigated, punished, or gagged by AHPRA simply for speaking out against the potential harms of gender medicine for children. They bring up a recent Senate committee hearing where Liberal Party Senator Sarah Henderson actually grilled AHPR's leadership. She summarized the whole situation by calling it, quote, a deeply disturbing abuse of regulatory power. Now, the broadcast does contrast this accusation with the defense provided by AHPR CEO Justin Unsteiner. Unsteiner countered that, sure, while practitioners absolutely have a right to free speech, that right gets constrained the second it veers into discrimination or hateful conduct that can harm the broader community. The host, however, pushes back on that, arguing it's just bureaucratic overreach suppressing vital scientific debate.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, Unintended Consequences of Taxation, looking specifically at the illicit tobacco market. Using tobacco as kind of the ultimate case study for government overreach, the broadcast points out a really specific number. Exactly $30 of the cost of an average $41.50 20-pack of cigarettes goes straight to excise tax. According to Senator Roberts, the real economic value of the product is only about $10 or $11. This massive markup, he argues, isn't actually stopping people from smoking. It's simply driving them to find it somewhere else. Senator Roberts points to an economic principle known as the Laffer curve to argue that the government has cranked taxes so high that revenues have actually collapsed. They list out a pretty wild string of unintended consequences. Smoking quit rates have basically flattened out, a massive, highly dangerous black market has exploded, and the illicit profits from that are now funding drug trafficking, firearms offenses, and property damage, like literally firebombing businesses. From their perspective, a policy that was supposed to improve public health has done nothing but enrich organized crime. Which brings us to Section 5, Energy Policy and Economics, and their critique of the Paris Agreement. Energy policy is a massive talking point for Senator Roberts, especially regarding national sovereignty. So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by this direct quote from the broadcast. He views the Paris Agreement and these net zero targets not as environmental necessities, but as self-imposed destructive measures. He openly criticizes both major parties for flip-flopping on net zero, arguing that by signing these international agreements, Australia is voluntarily gutting its own world-class electricity grid just to appease globalist agendas. To really support this argument that Australia is penalizing itself for no reason, Roberts contrasts some global coal production data. And the scale is pretty staggering. He notes that while Australia produces roughly 450 million tons of coal annually and agonizes over closing power stations, China is out there burning 53% of the world's coal, producing 4.7 billion tons a year, and building a brand new coal-fired power station every single week. Roberts then breaks down his whole economic theory of Australia's energy policy into this three-step cycle of destruction. First, he says Australia uses its wealth to subsidize imported solar panels and wind turbines, mostly coming from China. Second, transitioning the grid to these renewables completely drives up domestic electricity costs, which he points out is now the single highest cost category for manufacturing. And step 3 is the inevitable result, absolutely destroying local manufacturing competitiveness. In his view, Australia is literally paying money to dismantle its own economic advantage. Finally, Section 6, the uni-party critique, asking the big question, are the major parties identical? So after analyzing economics, health, taxes, and energy, the broadcast turns around and asks a deeply critical question about the Australian political system itself. Senator Roberts frequently uses the term uniparty to assert that, at the end of the day, there is virtually zero meaningful policy difference between the Labour and Liberal parties on the major issues. He argues both are equally pro-net zero, both are pro-high immigration, and both heavily favor centralized bureaucratic control. Interestingly enough, Roberts actually traces the rot of the supposedly conservative Liberal Party all the way back to the John Howard era, claiming Howard was a centralist and a control freak who laid the foundation for this total ideological convergence. And the broadcast wraps up its political analysis with a pretty bold claim that elected politicians aren't even the ones truly in charge anymore. They argue that unelected bureaucrats, backroom party power brokers, and massive global asset managers, think companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, actually hold the real levers of power. To the host and the senator, the major parties are just two different logos masking the exact same corporate and bureaucratic machinery. So, between the claims of a suffocating bureaucracy, punitive taxation, self-destructive energy policies, and a completely entrenched political duopoly, the host and his guest clearly view this as the absolute perfect storm driving third-party support. Which leaves us with the ultimate question. Are we simply witnessing a temporary wave of political frustration here, or will this rising popular sentiment permanently shatter Australia's traditional two-party system? It is definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me to unpack the source material, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.